get tonight's presentation underway. So thank you very much for coming to the Harmony Hall at the Palmer Historical Cultural Center. This being the 300th anniversary of the founding of Palmer, the lecture tonight is one of a series of lectures that we are offering on behalf of the 300th Celebration Committee, and some of those members are here, and I would like to acknowledge them. David Whitney is here, and Lorinda Baker, and am I missing anyone else? Oh, and Iris, yes, okay, and the Cardens. So thank you very much for joining us and being part of that committee. It's a lot of work, and I know you haven't got a lot of members. So we're glad we're able to help out here tonight. Tonight we have Donald Blais, who is presenting actually his second lecture here. Last year, he was just about a year ago, he was here and he presented President Lincoln and his biography. And tonight we are doing Eleanor Roosevelt. And Donald Blais is a counselor, Palmertown counselor. He had gone to school at Holyoke Community College, also Westfield State, and you were majoring in history at that point, right? And so we very much appreciate the effort. This just doesn't happen. In order to do your research and present a very thorough presentation, there's a lot of time and research that goes into it, and I know he has traveled to New York to get his information, and I will let him tell that part of the story. But thank you for your dedication and all the time to put this together, so welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Hadless, and good evening. It's so good to be back here at the Historical and Cultural Center. As Mr. Hadless mentioned, I was here last year for the 150th anniversary of the assassination of President Lincoln, and I just have to say, I was putting that presentation together. I had never done anything like that before, and I actually owe it to Representative Smolla, because he was here the previous fall talking about the Kennedy assassination, so that's where I got the idea from. And I just was amazed at the response. I spoke again in the fall at the library. I was invited to speak at Pathfinder, and I'm actually going to be speaking in Springfield on the assassination next month. So it was such a overwhelming success, and the response was so wonderful. And even my friends overseas watched it on YouTube, and they said, "Good job." So even my friend in Russia said, "Good job." I said, "Thank you." So I'm excited to be here and to speak on the life of Eleanor Roosevelt. Just real quick about how this project came about. As Mr. Hadless mentioned, about a year ago, actually it was right before, like days before I was here to talk about Abraham Lincoln, I took a trip down to Hyde Park. It's about 2 hours from here, so if you ever want an idea for a day trip, go right up the Mass Pike down the Taconic Parkway. It's a great site. And my friend who lives about 2 towns away joined me, and we went to the library. They had just remodeled it, redesigned it a couple years ago, so it's all new, digitalized. And then we went over to Valkill, which I'll talk about during the presentation. And it was my first time going, and I walked inside, and a lot of the stuff that's in there is reproduction. But one piece that had just been discovered about a few weeks prior, well, actually it had just gotten there 2 weeks before, it was a painting that Eleanor had actually done herself, and it was hanging in the living room. And we were one of the first groups to actually see it. So as I'm driving home, I'm thinking, okay, I want to do something on Eleanor, because she was she was a woman of her time. She's ranked one of our, if not our greatest First Lady for several reasons. And I hope tonight, when you walk out, you have you have an idea of why that is. And her life, I don't think people really focus too much on her life from the beginning. People tend to think mostly about her time as First Lady, but her early years was there were a lot of things that we think today, like, oh my God, like, how can someone endure all that? But she did. So I'm going to explain that to you tonight. And at the end, I'd be happy to take some questions, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So without further ado, let me take you back to the year 1884, when Eleanor Roosevelt was born. So Eleanor Roosevelt was born, there we go. So Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, she was born October the 11th, 1884, in New York City. And New York City at that time was the commercial capital of the United States. It was also, you could say, the political capital, where the major parties had their headquarters, where all the backroom deals were taking place. So New York City at that time was a real bustling city. You think it's crazy today. It was even crazy back in the 1880s. Her parents, Elliot Bullock Roosevelt and Anna Rebecca Hall. Elliot Roosevelt was the younger brother to Theodore Roosevelt. So when you ask, well, how is she connected to Theodore Roosevelt? Theodore Roosevelt was her uncle. His life was complicated. The Roosevelts were a very rich family. They had originated from Holland. They moved to New York City when it was still New Amsterdam. So this is in the 1600s. So they had been in New York City for well over 200 years by the time of Eleanor's birth. Her father, like many, unfortunately, in the Roosevelt family, suffered from alcoholism. He had a lot of other issues, from seizures, just the stress of being a Roosevelt. It would really get to him as he got into adulthood. He was actually, at one point, committed to an insane asylum in France. And that is where he would pass away at the age of 34. She had 2 siblings, Elliot Jr. and Hall. And her mother, and like with her father, who she was really close to, she wasn't very close to her mother. Her mother really, she for whatever reason, just did not want anything to do with her. She actually referred to her as being, she actually called her little granny because of her looks. So she didn't really want anything to do with Eleanor when she was very young. And that would have a big impact on Eleanor when she would become a mother down the road. So as I mentioned, her father died when he was only in his 30s. That also had an impact on her growing up. She was very devoted to him. She would never forget him. And also one thing to mention, her brother Elliot died. He was only 4 years old from, I think, diphtheria. And that was actually what her mother died from not too long afterwards. So as I mentioned, her father, he jumped out of the window because he had already lost his mind by then, and he died from that a couple of days later. And after that, she would live with her grandmother in Tivoli, which is about 20 miles north of Hyde Park. And that's where she would live until her teenage years. And it was really a difficult time in her life. She lived with a grandmother that was very controlling. She lived with 2 uncles that had problems of their own. So it was really a rough childhood for Eleanor Roosevelt. And but then one person came into her life and really got her going, and that was her Aunt Mammy. So again, connecting it to Theodore Roosevelt, that would be his older sister. And she looked at Eleanor and thought, she has a lot of potential. So it was Bammy's suggestion that Eleanor attend the Allenwood Academy in London, which she would for 3 years. And the headmistress, her name was Mademoiselle Sylvestre. She was a well-known feminist, and early on she looked at Eleanor and thought, this girl has a lot of potential. I'm going to teach her everything that I know. So while she was there, she would take classes in French, mathematics, all the courses that we take for granted. Well, back then, girls really didn't do that. So she was very fortunate to have that opportunity. And from her experience, she would really begin to grow independently for the first time. She didn't get to complete her time there because her grandmother wanted her to come back to make her social debut in New York City. She wasn't happy about it, but she complied and she went home before she could finish her schooling at Allenwood. So she gets back to New York City in 1902, and it wasn't too long after that she would become reacquainted with her distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And just a little quick reintroduction to FDR. So FDR, he was born January 30th of 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. His father was James Roosevelt, who was in his middle years when he met his mother, Sarah Delano. He was, I believe, 54 when he married Sarah. She was 25, so about half of his age. And again, like I said, the Roosevelts were a very wealthy family at that time. And one of my favorite stories, and I heard this for the first time watching the film The Roosevelts by Ken Burns. Did anyone see the series The Roosevelts by Ken Burns? If you haven't, it's a very, very good series. I highly recommend it. And there was a quote from Sarah's father talking about, and I don't have it exactly with me, but I'll paraphrase, saying that while not all horse thieves are Democrats, it's well assumed that most horse thieves are Democrats. Because Mr. James was a Democrat, and Mr. Delano was not a big fan of the Democrats. But nonetheless, he agreed to let his daughter marry James Roosevelt, and they would have one child named Franklin. He would grow up and go to Groton Academy in Connecticut. Wasn't a good experience for FDR, as he would later recall. But it had a big impact on him as he would become president down the road. And in December of 1900, Mr. James passed away from a heart attack. And like Eleanor with her father, Franklin would never forget his father growing up as an adult. So in 1902, FDR and Eleanor began a quiet, secret courtship. And in 1903, right around Thanksgiving, FDR tells his mother that he and Eleanor are engaged. Sarah doesn't really want them to get married, so she actually asked him, well, wait a year to make it official. For the reason, and she didn't tell him this, because she wanted him to forget Eleanor. And in fact, she actually took him on a cruise to the Caribbean with the thought, okay, well, I'm going to take you, forget about Eleanor, you'll find someone else. Well, it didn't work. So the following year, in the fall of 1904, they announced that they are going to get married. So on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1905, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt are married in New York City. The reason that they were married on March 17th was because it was a convenient day for her Uncle Theodore, because he was going to be in New York City at the St. Patrick's Day parade, and he was officially giving her off to Franklin. So they had the wedding, and that picture up on top is Eleanor in her wedding dress. And so they had the wedding ceremony, and Theodore famously tells Franklin, it's a good thing to keep the name in the family. But unfortunately for the newlyweds, the focus really wasn't on them. Now you'd think at a wedding that everyone would be focused on the new bride and the groom. Well, not at their wedding, because the President of the United States was there, so everyone was focused on talking to the President. So they were kind of ignored, but they got through it, and then they went on their honeymoon to Europe. They would eventually have 6 children. One died as an infant. Anna, James, Franklin Jr., he was the first. He only lived a very short time. Then Elliot, the second Franklin Jr., and John. And I had mentioned a few moments ago about Eleanor and her relationship with her mother, and it was not very good. And that would have an impact on her as a mother. Since she never felt really loved, never got the attention that she should have gotten from her mother, that was sort of the effect that would come down on her children. And as I was doing my research and I was reading her autobiography, which is a very, very good book, and she wrote this, and I thought this was very, very interesting. She wrote, I have never had any interest in little children. I knew absolutely nothing about handling or feeding a baby. And when her son, Franklin Jr., died, she would write, I was young and morbid and reproached myself bitterly for having done so little about the care of this baby. I felt he had been left too much to the nurse, and I knew too little about him, and that in some way I must be to blame. So, now, one of the most important parts of the story of Eleanor would be her relationship with her mother-in-law. She had hoped that Sarah Roosevelt would welcome her in as a daughter. That's not how it would turn out. So when they got back from their wedding in 1905, Sarah surprised them with a townhouse in, an apartment in New York City. And Franklin was all excited. Eleanor was not, because not only was it filled with furniture that Sarah had purchased, it was connected to Sarah's apartment. So there was a big glass window, a door, that you could just go right on in, and Sarah could just come in and do whatever she wanted. And Eleanor was not too happy with that. And she would tell her husband, I did not like to live in a house which was in not any way mine, one that I had nothing about and which did not represent the way I wanted to live. And when she told that to Franklin, he basically said, well, just be quiet. He brushed her off, and she lived with it. So despite many attempts to try to improve their, as I call, rocky relationship, never really happened. And that relationship would continue until Sarah passed away in 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor. So it was quite a long 30-plus years, or nearly 40 years, putting up with Sarah Roosevelt. I certainly couldn't have done it, but she did. So the early years. Franklin Roosevelt always had a desire to follow in Theodore's footsteps. In fact, the bottom picture there is the only known picture of Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt together. This was in the early 19-teens. So in 1910, Franklin Roosevelt was approached by the Dutchess County Democratic Party and said, we'd like you to run for the state senate. And he agreed. But then the next thing that happened was, and I find this very, 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 looking at it from a modern day perspective, no, I don't think anybody would do this. When Theodore Roosevelt was coming back from his trip to Europe and Africa, Franklin and Eleanor met him in New York City as he was getting off the boat. And Franklin approached Theodore and said, I'm going to run for the state senate, but I'm going to run as a Democrat, and I want your support. And Theodore Roosevelt said, yes, go ahead. He was disappointed that he would run as a Democrat, but he gave him his blessing. Now, I don't think any politician today would go out of their way to ask someone's permission or blessing. They would just do it. But Franklin Roosevelt did, because he loved and respected Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt gave him his approval, and he went about campaigning. And he won, despite actually crossing into Connecticut one day, campaigning. If you go down to Dutchess County, that is one of the best stories in that part of New York, was him campaigning in Connecticut inadvertently. But he won, and Eleanor's reaction to it was, I think Franklin always intended to go into politics. I think Uncle Ted was responsible for that. So he would serve one full term in the state senate. In 1912, he would campaign for Woodrow Wilson for president. Eleanor supported her Uncle Ted, who was running as a third-party candidate. And no, 1912 was a very dynamic election year. We may have that this coming year. So if you're looking for a parallel to this year, I think 1912 might be a good example for that. So when Woodrow Wilson's elected, he asks Franklin to come down to Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which was an office that Theodore Roosevelt had once held. So the Roosevelts moved down to Washington, and for Eleanor, it was her first exposure to Washington society. And it would help her a great deal when she became First Lady in 1933. So they would host members of the Supreme Court, their wives, and members of Congress, and all the people, big people down in Washington. It really helped her out. In 1917, we're coming up on the anniversary of that next year, the United States entered World War I. So Franklin was quite busy at the Navy Department, but for Eleanor, she volunteered her time at the Red Cross, working at the canteen. She actually would go volunteer at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C. That was actually, it was a facility where soldiers coming back from the front who suffered through shell shock, PTSD, were housed. And it had a big impact on Eleanor. There were images that she would never forget as she got older. The following year, in 1918, Franklin goes on a trip to Europe to inspect the Navy ports. And he comes back in the fall very ill. He had pneumonia. And one day, just after he got back, Eleanor's going through his luggage and discovers some letters. They were love letters. They weren't from her. They were from her former secretary, Lucy Mercer. Now, Lucy Mercer had been her secretary. She'd been hired in 1914. She was welcomed into the Roosevelt home. But then she grew attached to Franklin. Now, the speculation is that the affair began sometime in 1916, when Eleanor and the family would go up to their home on Campbell Island, just off on the Canadian border, off the coast of Maine. And by 1917, there was already gossip going around in the capital that something was going on. And in fact, right around that same time, Eleanor dismissed her, and she went right over to the Navy Department and got hired by the Secretary of the Navy and was assigned to Franklin's office. So it allowed them to continue seeing each other. But by this time, the rumors were already going around that they were seeing each other. So much that Alice Roosevelt, the oldest daughter to Theodore Roosevelt, would say, and would encourage them to do it by saying, he deserved a good time. He was married to Eleanor. Alice Roosevelt did not like Franklin or Eleanor. It got very nasty later on when Franklin was president. She discovers the letters, and he confesses. I would think in a situation like that, you may try to deny it. He actually opened up and said, yes, it's true. And then Eleanor says, okay, I'll give you your freedom. You want a divorce? Go ahead. And while I try not to put someone a century from where they were, if this had happened in 2018 instead of 1918, they probably would have gone their separate ways, and we never would have heard from Eleanor again. But that didn't happen because, of all people, Sarah Roosevelt stepped in. And she tells her son, all right, you want to go off? You want to leave Eleanor? Go ahead. But here's the deal. If you do, I'm going to cut off your funding. You're going to get nothing. You're done. Franklin, realizing the situation, says, okay, I will stay with Eleanor. And he promises never to see Lucy Mercer again. But as it turns out, and I'll explain to it shortly, that didn't happen. So reflecting on it years later, Eleanor said, I have the memory of an elephant. I can forgive, but never forget. The bottom dropped out of my own particular world, and I faced myself, my surroundings, my world, honestly, for the first time. And from that point on, the nature of their relationship changed from more of a intimate, private relationship to more of a business type. And that's the kind of relationship they would have in the White House. So the following year is 1920, and it's an election year. So the Democrats nominate a man named James Cox. He was the governor of Ohio. Woodrow Wilson had had a stroke the previous year, so he couldn't run for a third term even if he wanted to, and he probably did. And Mr. Cox, realizing that he needs to balance the ticket, picks Franklin Roosevelt to be vice president. So another step on the road to the White House. That's what Theodore did. He was elected vice president in 1900. So they go out campaigning across the country, and for Eleanor, this was a first-time experience. And she would say, she said, "On this trip, I saw a great deal of our country that I had never seen before, though I had not begun to look at the countryside or the people with the same keenness which the knowledge of many social problems brought me in the future. But still, I was thrilled by new scenery, and the size of my own country with its potential power was gradually drawing upon me." Well, Franklin never became vice president because the ticket got defeated overwhelmingly. I think it was 60% for the Republicans. So it was Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, who we all know spent time in Northampton. They were elected, and Franklin and Eleanor go back to New York. But then the following year, a new crisis would arise, and that would be Franklin coming down with polio. So I call this, it's been described as a trial by fire, and it really was. So it was August of 1921, and the family is up in vacationing up in Campbell Island. And one day in early August, Franklin goes for a swim in a local lake. He begins to feel a chill. He feels something's not right. And he goes up to bed, and Eleanor brings him his supper. The next morning, it was August 10th, 1921. He tries to get out of bed. His legs couldn't move. And it was from that point on he would never walk again. And so for a couple weeks, Eleanor, FDR's close advisor, Louis Howe, they were with him. They weren't sure what was going on. And finally, they brought up a specialist from Boston, and he diagnosed it as infantile paralysis. And it really began a trial, like I said, trial by fire. So as Franklin was being treated, another battle between Eleanor and Sarah really began. Sarah Roosevelt wanted her son to just live quietly at Hyde Park, play with his stamp collection, just live a quiet life. Eleanor saw it differently. She wanted him to stay active, fight back against this attack by polio, and stay involved in politics, because that was his life. Eventually, Eleanor would win the fight, or the battle, but it was not easy. Speaking on it later, Eleanor would say, "I think probably the thing that took the most courage in his life was his mastery and his meaning of polio." And the picture on the bottom here, this is actually on display at the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. Those are his actual braces, and they were very uncomfortable. How he managed it is beyond me, but he did it for a good 25 years. For the rest of his life, actually, from 1921 until his death in 1925. So for Eleanor, while Franklin was trying to get back on his feet, this was for her an opportunity to really break out on her own, to speak up for her husband, but to also speak up for herself. And she would do that in a lot of ways. So during the 1920s, she would join many different organizations, including the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union, the Women's Division of the New York Democratic Party. She would become friends with many different activists. Marion Dickerman, Nancy Cook, they're actually up there in the picture. If I'm right, I believe Nancy Cook is to her right, and I think Marion Dickerman is to her left, I believe. An example of her involvement. In 1924, she would actually wage a battle with the New York Party chairman over who would control the delegates, the women delegates to the convention. It was either the bosses or the women. she outdid him, and it was a real win over the bosses. They didn't like that, but she was successful. Another from 1924. She actually went out and campaigned against her own cousin, Theodore Jr. So Theodore Roosevelt's son was running for governor in New York, and since he was in the Harding administration, obviously, as you know, the big scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal. They actually went out campaigning across New York, so wherever he would go, Eleanor would follow him with a big model of a teapot. And the result was, while on the national side, it was a big Republican year, so Calvin Coolidge was elected, but in New York, Governor Al Smith was actually reelected by a lot. And Theodore never forgave Eleanor for that. And Eleanor later admitted that she had gone a little too far. But she was a big supporter of Al Smith when he ran for governor and then president in 1924 and 1928. And also during this time, she would actually teach. She actually taught at the Todd Hunter private school in New York City. She taught history. She taught English. And that was something that she really never wanted to give up. And in fact, when Franklin became governor in 1928, she actually said, "I want to continue this." And in fact, in 1928, Franklin ran for governor. Al Smith, on the second try, was nominated for president. He was the first Catholic to be nominated for president by a major party. And it was Al Smith's idea that Franklin should run. Eleanor, everyone close to Franklin didn't want him to, but he did. And as it turned out, Al Smith lost the presidency pretty badly to Herbert Hoover, but in New York State, Franklin was narrowly elected to the first of 2 terms as governor of New York. And as a result of that, Eleanor resigned from a lot of her political associations, so she kept on teaching in New York City. And I believe she did that until he became president in 1933. So just real briefly, Eleanor and the relationship with her children. As I had mentioned, from her relationship with her mother, it kind of wore on her as a mother. And especially during the 1920s, as Franklin was off either in Florida or at Warm Springs, and Eleanor was out doing her own political thing, it really had an effect on the children. They didn't really have a close relationship with their parents, and it really had an impact on them growing up. And in fact, Sarah Roosevelt, not knowing when to mind her business, I wouldn't describe her as a tyrant, but I would describe her as something close to that, because she was very dominant, very overwhelming. And at one point, she actually told Eleanor, the children, quote, "I am your real mother. Your mother only bore you." I cannot believe she actually would do that, but she did. And like Franklin, the sons were sent off to Groton Academy. But the one child that was really impacted by all this was Anna Roosevelt. In fact, when Franklin was brought home after getting attacked, after coming down with polio, Anna Roosevelt actually had to give up her room to Louis Howe, and she actually slept in a smaller room, I think up on the 3rd or 4th floor, and she really resented that down the road. But Eleanor would later take responsibility for that. And from that point on, her and Anna would grow very close. But for the rest of the children, it never got as strong as it should have been. And in fact, as years would go by, all the children would grow up. They would marry when they shouldn't have. And there would be several divorces as a result of it. And when Anna was asked later on why she got married so young, she simply said, "To get out." So it was not a good situation. If you were a son or daughter of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, it was just not a good situation. It wasn't. And in fact, this is a picture of the children in the late 19-teens. So Valkill, as I mentioned, I went to Valkill last year. It is a great historic site. And it was Franklin's idea to give Eleanor a space of her own, away from the house, Sarah's house. And it's located about 2 miles east from the main site in Hyde Park. It was built along a local creek. And so during the 1920s, Eleanor would live there with Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. And from the cottage, she actually operated a small business. They actually made furniture. And if you go there, there's a big exhibit about the business. And it actually lasted through the Great Depression. It finally, just because the Depression was so severe, they couldn't keep up with it. So by the mid-1930s, actually 1938, is when the strains caught up to it. But after 1947, she was no longer First Lady. She lived full-time at Valkill, and she lived there until her death in 1962. And it's now a part of the National Park Service. And so if you get a chance to go down there, it is a beautiful site. Best time to go, I would say, is in the spring. It's a beautiful place. So by 1932, the Great Depression, it's in its fourth year. And Franklin is being talked of as a candidate for president. He was nominated on the 4th ballot. He's actually the last president to be elected after being nominated past first ballot. So if that were to happen this year, that would be historic. It hasn't happened since 1932. And in November, he was elected president of the United States. And so while the country is happy, we have a new president that's going to take on the Depression, for Eleanor, this was not a good moment. She did not want to become First Lady. She did not want to live in the White House. And years later, reflecting on it, she would say, end quote, "I knew what traditionally lay before me, and I cannot say I was pleased at the prospect. The turmoil in my heart and mind was rather great that night." And this is actually her official portrait in the White House. So it's now early 1933, and she's now the First Lady, and she's not sure, well, what's my role? As time would go on, she would find what her role would be. She would become a big supporter and advocate for the New Deal. So in what way was she an advocate? What did she do? Well, almost right away, she would go out, she would start traveling across the country on fact-finding missions, basically going anywhere you can think of, even a coal mine. She went to a lot of places. So she went around to get a sense of what was going on in the country. She would report back to Franklin, who could not travel because of being in a wheelchair. And she would report back on the progress of the New Deal, and if it was working, if it wasn't working, what could be done to fix it. And over the course of the first few years in the White House, Eleanor would come to support most, if not all, of the programs of the New Deal. The National Recovery Act, the WPA, the CCC, all of these programs that really defined what would become the New Deal. In fact, that's Eleanor and Nancy Cook. That's actually at their cottage at Valkill, and that is one of the signs that says that they're supporting the NRA. And I thought this quote was a very appealing and just talks about Eleanor's support of the New Deal. This was said by the administrator of the New Deal, Rexford Tugwell. He said, "No one who ever saw Eleanor Roosevelt sit down facing her husband and holding his eyes firmly say to him, 'Franklin, I think you should,' or 'Franklin, surely you will ever forget the experience.'" So she was really a pivotal part of her husband's success with the New Deal. and it would really define her early years as First Lady. She would also advocate FDR to appoint more women, more minorities to the administration. And she would say on that, I sometimes acted as a spur, even though the spurring was not always wanted. So one of her big projects, and forgive me, I know there's a lot written up there. I actually edited some of it earlier tonight. But one of her biggest projects was in the community of Arthurdale, West Virginia. In early 1933, Lorena Hickok, who had been a reporter for the Associated Press, she actually resigned her job because she became very close friends with Eleanor, and there's some questions about that, which if I'm asked about it, I'll address it. But she was given a role in the administration, and while she was traveling across the South, she became aware of a problem in West Virginia with a lot of coal miners that had lost their jobs, and it was a really dire situation. So Eleanor got involved with it, and she actually would visit Morgantown, which is where a lot of the homeless coal miners were living. And Eleanor proposed a very bold idea. The idea was to relocate all these coal miners to a newly developed community. And the goal was, okay, the government will help this community get itself going and will eventually become self-efficient. It'll be on its own. She got so involved. She actually would supervise most of the project, including choosing the refrigerators in the houses. That's real dedication. She also encouraged businesses like General Electric to invest in the community. But over time, the project would fail. For budgetary, political reasons, Republicans referred to it as a communist plot. I don't know how, but that's what so they thought of it. One of the downsides of the project, the people that moved there actually voted to make it a white-only community. And Eleanor was very, very disappointed with that. And by 1940, most of the support of it had gone away. But actually, Eleanor continued to stay up on it. She actually would visit Arthurdale as late as 1960, actually dedicated the local Presbyterian church. So it was a big project for Eleanor, but in the long run, it really wasn't a success. From her dealings with Arthurdale, her next big issue in the 30s was actually on civil rights, and in particular, this proposed anti-lynching bill. But before I get to that, as I mentioned, she was very critical of the lack of African Americans in the administration in the New Deal. And she wanted all those discriminating policies to be taken out. She actually, and later on saying, we have never been willing to face this problem, to line up with it, with the basic underlying beliefs in democracy. Another big project that she worked on was trying to get an anti-lynching bill passed in Congress. Lynching was a very serious problem. There had been hundreds of lynches throughout the South. Prior to the 30s and then during the 30s. And so Eleanor really tried to get the Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill. But the problem was for Franklin, he was focused on getting the economy going. And the problem was most of the committee chairs were Southerners. So for Franklin, if he said, yes, let's pass this anti-lynching bill, then his New Deal program would stop. He would get no support in the Congress. So he never committed to it, unfortunately, because he needed Southern support for the New Deal. The response in the South was not to positive. Eleanor actually got threats from the KKK. And that would not be the first time. She would get more of those throughout the years. She's also well known for her speaking up for Marian Anderson in 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution denied her the opportunity to sing at Constitutional Hall. It was Constitutional Hall. So Eleanor resigned she was actually a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she resigned her position, and then she arranged for Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. And that is one of the most beautiful performances, I think, in American history. And that was all due to Eleanor's advocacy that she be allowed to sing, and she finally did at the Lincoln Memorial. And that's actually her with Marian Anderson. And 75,000 people attended that event in 1939. So what was her relationship with the public? Well, when they got to the White House in 1933, the White House only had one person to respond to any letters that the president got. They got so overwhelmed with letters, in fact, 300,000 letters. They had to hire 50 people to handle from all over the country. The White House had never experienced anything like that before. She would also, again, she would travel the country for her husband, but she would also do it giving speeches. She was the first lady to give public lectures, or paid lectures. There's a lot of firsts with Eleanor Roosevelt as first lady. She was the first lady to hold a press conference. And in fact, that's the women, the reporters there in the bottom. They were all women. And that was because there were no women reporters allowed to ask the president questions at his press conferences. So she said, okay, well, I'm going to have my own press conference, and it's going to be women only. And she did that all 12 years of her time in the White House. Beginning in 1935, she would begin a daily news column called My Day. She would write for almost 30 years. And having read a lot of her newspaper columns over the last few months, she had a lot of things to say. And it was distributed all across the country. Over 62 newspapers across the country carried her newspaper column. But not everyone liked Eleanor Roosevelt. As much as she was loved by most people, there were some that didn't think too highly of her. And this is one of my favorite quotes. It was written by a Michigan woman in 1941, leading up to Pearl Harbor, and she wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt. Quote, Mrs. Roosevelt, you would be doing a great service if you would simply go home and sew for the Red Cross. Every time you open your mouth, the people of this country dislike and mistrust you more. She didn't take her advice. I would like to have been there when she read that letter, and I would love to have asked her, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, what are you going to do? She did not take that woman's advice. So life in the White House during the 1930s. Eleanor had a very busy schedule, but she did maintain she had a busy schedule outside, but she had a busy schedule in the White House too. And she would, keep doing that. During her time as First Lady, she would continue, despite the fact she did not want to be just a hostess, she would host many teas, many functions, as a traditional First Lady would. She even having parties for women, for the wives of members of Congress, again, justices of the Supreme Court, and wives of newspapermen. In fact, Franklin would have his own cocktail, his own private parties, and people did not like his cocktails. They were too sweet, apparently. So just to give an example of how busy it was in the White House in the 1930s, in 1939 alone, they would host 4,729 people for dinner. Over 300 were house guests. Over 9,000 for tea, just for tea. 14,000 were received at teas and receptions, and over 1 million would visit the White House. So they were a very, very public and very well-liked first family, despite the criticism from some people. And another favorite story from that I discovered in my research, Eleanor would actually at night would leave her husband memorandum letters in what was called the Eleanor basket, and he said to her, "You can leave up to 10. I will read them," because he was getting tired of Eleanor just coming in bombarding him with all this stuff that he really didn't have time for. So he came up with this idea of having this Eleanor basket, leave the letters, the memorandum, and he will get to it at night. And he did that throughout their time in the White House. But whenever she had the chance, she would actually escape. She would actually drive her own car, despite the fact the Secret Service didn't like that. And it's actually a picture of her in her own car going for a drive. For her, that was her chance to get away, to be free, to really feel free. Of course, the condition the Secret Service had was carry a pistol. So she actually had a gun in the car as she would go for a drive. And over the years in the White House, they would host many guests, including famously Winston Churchill. And one of my favorite Churchill stories was it was right after Pearl Harbor, and Churchill was visiting the White House. They were conferring with FDR about the war. And one night, Franklin Roosevelt was wheeled in to see Churchill, and Churchill was getting out of the bathtub, naked, stark naked. And and FDR is like, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I'll come right back in." And Churchill says, "No, it's okay. As you can see, Mr. President, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." So that's Churchill was a very, very crazy character. So by 1936, the country was beginning to recover from the Depression, although it would take a couple more years. FDR was elected to a second term, winning all but 2 states, Maine and Vermont. And in fact, those 2 states, he never won either of those states. The 4 times he ran for president, he never won Maine, and he never won Vermont. Never. But by the middle of his second term, the threat was the threat of the Depression was subsiding, and the new threat was World War II. And Eleanor, recognizing that war is probably coming, she didn't want her husband to ignore or forget the New Deal, and so she kept advocating, keep up with the New Deal, don't let it go. Eventually, he would have to. And as war became inevitable, Eleanor really began speaking out, advocating that the United States allow more European refugees, Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria to come into the United States, despite there was a lot of opposition to that. And in the summer of 1939, the Roosevelts would host the King and Queen of Great Britain. And I had to include this because this is a very fascinating story. So in the summer of 1939, King George VI, the father of the current Queen of England, and his wife, her mother, came over to the United States. They were here for 5 days. And the purpose of the visit was to get the United States to help Great Britain as war was coming closer. And has anyone seen the movie Hyde Park on Hudson? Okay, it's a very good movie. It's a fictionalized version of what happened, but I would say it's a very good movie nonetheless. So they invited the king and queen to visit Hyde Park. They were there for 2 days, and the highlight of the visit was a hot dog picnic. It was Eleanor's idea, despite the fact that Sarah did not like it. They did it anyway. Part of the itinerary was a dance from a native tribe, Ishti. I can't pronounce his name at the moment, but it was it was so crazy, but it worked, and the visit would be a success, and it would really forge it was really the beginning of the strong ties between America and Great Britain, and as Churchill would later say, a special relationship. And I'll tell you, having friends that are British, it is a special relationship. It really is. And 3 months later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland and World War II begins. So by 1940, Eleanor is getting very tired of being First Lady. She actually would tell Franklin, "You better retire in 1941 or I'm out of here." And she probably would have done it, but she didn't. Many people said, okay, he's done, two-term tradition. But with the war expanding, a lot of people were saying, you got to run for a third term. So at the Democratic Convention in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was renominated for a third term. But then there was a problem, because his pick for vice president was a man named Henry Wallace. He had been a former Republican. He was Secretary of Agriculture. But he was there was a lot of opposition to his nomination. And Franklin Roosevelt actually threatened to not run if Wallace wasn't picked. So there was a lot of chaos at the Democratic Convention, and it was Franklin's idea, why don't we send Eleanor to address the convention? Well, she didn't really want to, but she was talked into it. And so in July of 1940, she became the First Lady in history to address a political convention. And that, in fact, is her speaking in 1940. And I tried very hard to get the audio from her speech, but I could not get it. But I have a quote from her speech. She would say, "This is no ordinary time, no time for weighing anything except what we can best do for the country." The Republicans would nominate a man named Wendell Willkie. In fact, that is a slogan that is a Democratic slogan, no third-term Democrats for Willkie. But Franklin Roosevelt was reelected to a third term and is the only president to serve more than 2 terms in office. So by late 1941, war was becoming very inevitable. And right after Sarah Roosevelt passed away, and in fact her brother Hall also died in September of 1941. He also struggled from alcoholism, and he had a very difficult life. Right after his passing, Eleanor briefly worked with Mayor LaGuardia of New York for the Office of Civilian Defense. It was not a paid position, but she ran into trouble when she recommended a friend for a position, and it caused a lot of controversy. And in fact, the Congress actually tried passing a resolution just to mock her and to make her look bad. Didn't really work out, but she eventually resigned from that position. But then on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked our naval base at Pearl Harbor, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. Later that day, let me back up. Now, when writing this, I was thinking of September the 11th, and I can remember when President Bush addressed the nation that night. Now, you would think December 7th that the first person the country would hear from was Franklin Roosevelt, but it was actually Eleanor, because, and I didn't mention this before, she also had a radio program. So on the night of December 7th, 1941, she actually spoke to the country first. And I have a little bit of her clipping right now. And what makes this project so special is you can actually hear her speak, whereas with my Lincoln speech, you don't have any audio. But I just want to play a little sample of what she said on December 7th, 1941.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy, no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it.
So that's a little bit of Eleanor speaking on the night of December 7th. And in fact, right afterwards, and I didn't play that part of the audio, she actually spoke to the mothers of the country, telling them, I have a son, I have sons that are going into the service. And I think it really, really helped people out there with the shock of what had just happened, and the understanding that we were now at war, and that it was going to be a very long and very deadly affair, and as it would turn out to be. So during World War II, Eleanor, again, just like her advocacy during the New Deal, would now slowly turn towards the war effort, and she would again be an advocate for women, African Americans, to be a part of the war effort. She would campaign. In fact, so one of the things she actually would campaign for during the war would actually be for government-sponsored childcare. So as the men were going into the army and the war industries needed help, a lot of women would be hired, and they needed childcare. So one of the programs she actually advocated for was for government-sponsored childcare. And she would be a big advocate for African Americans in the North and the South, but there was a lot of opposition to that, and there were actually a lot of race riots. There were some actually here in Massachusetts during World War II. And Eleanor would get the blame for that. And in fact, the editor of the Daily News in Jackson, Mississippi, would write, and I quote, "It is blood on your hands, Mrs. Roosevelt. You have been personally proclaiming and practicing social equality at the White House and wherever you go. What followed now is history." And Eleanor responded by saying, "Unless we make the country worth fighting for by Negroes, we have nothing to offer the world at the end of the war." And another very controversial issue would be Japanese internment. Initially, she supported the idea of Japanese internment, but as the war would go on and she would actually hear reports of what was going on, she actually would oppose what her husband had done. And in fact, in 1943, she actually visited the Gila River Relocation Center in Arizona. And then it was suggested to bring a family to the White House. The Secret Service said no. So during the war, she was a big advocate for women in the war industry. She was a big advocate for African Americans to be a part of it. Also in 1943, suggested by her husband, Eleanor would embark on a 5-week journey to the South Pacific. She would visit several countries: Australia, New Zealand, and I think up to 19 small islands, including Guadalcanal. She went there officially to inspect Red Cross installations. In fact, that is a picture of her. It's kind of hard to see up there in her Red Cross uniform. The commander in the South Pacific was a man named William Halsey, and he was, Halsey, and he was against her trip to the South Pacific, saying, and I quote, that he didn't have time to welcome a visiting do-gooder. But soon his mind would change as she would go around touring Red Cross installations, visiting with the wounded. In fact, one soldier would later write, "Over here, she was something none of us had seen in over a year, an American mother." She would come back. She would return to the United States, just exhausted and visiting the graves of the fallen, it really, again, like in 1917, would have a big impact on her. But again, there was criticism to Eleanor's visit. And she would say, quote, "The outcry in Congress is so great that FDR feels that I should not use government transport or even go on any long trips for a while. Later, I'm sure he'll say go ahead again, but just now it seems he wants a little peace." So, but by 1944, FDR's health was beginning to decline. And in March of 1944, he was secretly diagnosed as having congestive heart failure. Only a few people close to FDR knew it, but the one person that was not part of the group that knew was Eleanor. He did not want her to know, and for a good while she didn't realize what was happening. And when the talk about running for a fourth term, Eleanor would say, "I wouldn't discuss it with him because I hated the idea and he knew I hated it. Either he felt he ought to serve a fourth term and wanted it, or he didn't. That was up to the man himself to decide and no one else." So despite his declining health, he runs for a fourth term, and in fact at the convention, Henry Wallace was kicked off the ticket. He was seen as too liberal and pro-communist, which he was very far left, and in place, and Eleanor actually supported him. She actually wrote a newspaper column supporting him. FDR said, don't write it, and well, write it, but don't put it out yet. So in his place, the Democrats nominated Harry Truman for vice president. So in 1944, he ran against Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, who would run again in 1948, and he was reelected to a fourth term. And as you can see by the pictures, particularly the top picture, he was in very bad health by 1944. The country was reelecting a dying man. That was just the truth. So April 12th, 1945. Early in the day, Eleanor was at a luncheon in Washington, D.C. And a short time after, she got a phone call from the press secretary to the president, and he asked her to come back to the White House immediately. And when she got to the White House, she got word that her husband had passed away. She asked for Vice President Truman to come to the White House immediately, and she sent out a telegram to her sons overseas saying that Pa had passed away. He did his duty up to the end as he wanted to. So when Harry Truman gets to the White House, and he never was really close to FDR, even during the campaign or in the short time that he was vice president, he was never really close to FDR. And when he got there, Eleanor walks up to him and says, "Harry, the president is dead." And the soon-to-be president was shocked, and he says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And Eleanor's famous response was, "Is there anything we can do for you are the one in trouble now?" So after the new president is sworn in, she flies down to Warm Springs. That's where FDR had been when he passed away. And when she gets to Warm Springs, she discovers that that day when he passed away, Lucy Mercer had been with him. Now, I had said before that FDR had promised never to see Lucy again. Well, that didn't happen. They actually kept in touch. She had actually been to all of his inaugurations. But beginning in 1941, he had requested that she come to the White House when Eleanor wasn't there, under the name Mrs. Johnson. So for about 4 years, when Eleanor was away on her trip to the South Pacific, for example, Lucy Mercer Rutherford would quietly go to the White House, and it was more of a friendship. I personally don't think it was anything more than that. And in fact, it was Lucy Mercer Rutherford that had asked the painter to paint that painting of FDR that was left unfinished. Eleanor was obviously not happy to hear that her husband had done this behind her back. And later, James Roosevelt would write, and it was her daughter Anna that would quietly arrange the visits. So James Roosevelt would later write, "Mother was angry at Anna, but what was Anna to do?" And I just want to read real quick something that Eleanor had written years later, talking about the train ride back from Warm Springs to Washington, D.C. And she would say, gotta find it real quick. Almost impersonal, perhaps, because much further back I had to face certain difficulties until I decided to accept the fact that a man must be what he is. Life must be lived as it is, and you cannot live at all if you do not learn to adapt yourself to your life as it happens to be. So that was her reflection on the train ride back from Warm Springs to Washington, D.C. And then saying a few days later that so a couple days later, a reporter in New York City had caught up to her and tried asking her questions, and Eleanor famously said, "The story is over." But the story was not quite over yet. But looking back on the period with her husband, she would say, "Franklin's death ended a period in history, and now in its wake, for lots of us who lived in his shadow, periods come, and we have to start again under our own momentum and wonder what we can achieve." And as I just said, the story was not over. So later in 1945, the new president, Harry Truman, asks Eleanor to serve as a delegate to the new United Nations. And at first she was reluctant, but she eventually said, "Yes, I'll do it." And she would serve with two Republicans, a senator named Arthur Vandenberg, who was a very staunch opponent to FDR during his presidency, and a man named John Foster Dulles, who would in fact become Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. Eleanor was put on Committee 3. The reason that she was, they thought of her as, she's just here for publicity. Well, she's not going to do much. So they put her on this committee called Committee 3. And it would turn out to be the Human Rights Commission. And she would, in fact, be the one responsible for drafting what would become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you can see right up there. But also during her time, before I get to the Declaration of Human Rights, she would address many other issues, including humanitarian, economic, cultural issues. And as I said, she would actually become chair of the Human Rights Commission. And in December of 1948, the United Nations adopted the Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm going to just play another clip. This was her speaking in 1948 about the Declaration of Human Rights.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. We hope its proclamation by the General Assembly will be an event comparable to the proclamation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man by the French people in 1789, the adoption of the Bill of Rights by the people of the United States, and the adoption of comparable declarations at different times in other countries.
So that was Eleanor speaking on the, in fact, that was her addressing the United Nations. The General Assembly passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was, the Security Council and then the General Assembly. And after the vote in the General Assembly, the delegates, for the only time in the history of the UN, stood up and applauded one of their own delegates, and that was for Eleanor Roosevelt. And then, of course, over the years, when she was or was out of the in or out of the UN, she would travel the world, being an advocate on humanitarian, like I said, economic issues, even traveling to the Soviet Union as an elderly lady. There's actually a picture of her standing I believe it was at Red Square, trying to get in to see the body of I believe it was Lenin. Just absolutely incredible. And it was from her work at the UN that Eleanor would really grow to distrust the Soviet Union. And as the Cold War, by this time the Cold War was really escalating, and Eleanor became concerned about the impacts at home, particularly on civil liberties and and responding to that, she would create this organization called the Liberal Americans for Democratic Actions, and it was an advocacy group, that really would champion, letting people speak their mind. That's what they were for. She would become a staunch critic of Joseph McCarthy and his famous House Committee of Un-American Activities. And writing in her newspaper column in 1947, she would write, "What is going on with the Un-American Activities Committee worries me. We find ourselves living in the atmosphere of a police state, where people close doors before they state what they think or look over their shoulders apprehensively before they express an opinion." And her activism, and this is, I think, one of the craziest parts of her life. It worried people, including J. Edgar Hoover, and he actually would create a file of over 3,000 pages just on Eleanor Roosevelt. And that is in fact her file. That was J. Edgar Hoover's file on Eleanor, and it's now at the FDR Library. So if you ever go to the FDR Library, you will see it standing literally right in the middle of the display. And that's where it had all of her files. It's pretty unique. And up until her death, she would continue to urge Washington and Moscow to keep the dialogue open. And that's, in fact, Eleanor with Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. And like her advocacy in the 1930s, she would become a big advocate for civil rights in the 1950s, joining the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality. She would call for the end of the poll tax in the southern states, integration of the armed forces in public schools, the Little Rock Nine, for example. She was very outspoken on that. She would also advocate for a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission during the 50s. She even drafted the Civil Rights Platform at the 1956 Democratic Convention. And in 1958, she traveled down to Tennessee to an integration. It was a workshop at a school in Tennessee, and she got threats from the KKK. And the local sheriff, who was a member of the KKK, said, "I can't protect you. I can't guarantee your safety." But she went anyway. That's how devoted she was to civil rights. And she would continue that until her passing in 1962. And she even, before I move on, she was a big supporter of the Freedom Riders in 1961. And she would say, right before her death, she said, "Staying aloof is not a solution. It is a cowardly evasion." And that's her with Martin Luther King. And she was a big advocate for women's rights. She lobbied the Truman and the Eisenhower administrations to appoint more women to government service. And even though she wouldn't run for office herself, she encouraged women to run for office and be a voice in the government, which they would. She was actually an opponent to the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. I was actually quite surprised to discover that. But throughout the 50s and 60s, she was actually encouraged to not continue to publicly oppose it, and she would do that. She was actually invited by President Kennedy in 1961 to chair the President's Commission on the Status of Women, but unfortunately, she died before the report was issued in 1963, I believe it was issued. And she was also a political activist in the 40s and 50s. She was a big supporter of Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956. And in fact, during the 1956 campaign, she was actually being interviewed, and she was asked what she thought of the incumbent vice president, Richard Nixon. And I'm just going to play a little bit of that audio, and that's the last of the audio.
Will you tell us how you feel about Mr. Nixon running as he is for vice president?
Yes, I know how I feel personally, but I know that what I feel personally is probably a feeling that might not be shared by other people. I'm told that Mr. Nixon is a very fine young man by many Republican people whom I know, particularly young people, and that he is matured and grown in many ways. I happen to remember very clearly his campaign for the senatorship. I had no respect for the way in which he accused Helen Hagan Douglas of being a communist because he knew that was how he would be elected. And I have no respect for the kind of character that takes advantage and does something they know is not true. He knew that she might be a liberal, but he knew quite well, having known her and worked with her, that she was not a communist. And I've always felt that anyone who wanted an election so much that they would use those means did not have the character that I really admired in public life.
Eleanor wasn't the only one who did not like Richard Nixon, even in the this was in 1956, and Richard Nixon would continue in public service until 1974. So she wasn't the first one to speak out against Richard Nixon. But 4 years later, in 1960, after John F. Kennedy was nominated for president, at first, she actually, again, she was a big supporter of Blais Stevenson. He tried getting the nomination again, but lost it to John F. Kennedy. And she eventually came around to supporting John F. Kennedy for president. And then, of course, he was elected in 1960. But by the beginning of 1962, her health was really beginning to decline. And she would pass away on November 7th of 1962 at the age of 78, and she would be buried next to her husband in Hyde Park. And in fact, that's a picture up on top. And people attending the funeral included President and Mrs. Kennedy, former Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Mrs. Eisenhower, Mrs. Truman, future President Lyndon Johnson, and I believe Lady Bird attended the funeral. And Blais Stevenson, speaking at her funeral, would say about Eleanor Roosevelt, "What other single human being has touched and transformed the existence of so many? She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." And the bottom picture there is her burial in Hyde Park, right next to the house. So what is her lasting legacy? And this is a question that I was asking myself as I was putting this together. And you could really say women's rights issues, speaking out on civil rights, her battling the boss system in the 20s. But you could also say it was all of that. And also you could say her advocacy for human rights worldwide. You could say all of that. Before she passed away in 1962, she was asked about the afterlife, and she said, "I don't know whether I believe in a future life. I believe that all you go through here must have some value. I think I am pretty much of a fatalist. You have to accept whatever comes, and the only important thing is that you meet it with courage and with the best that you have to give." And she certainly did that. And when we look back on her life and her legacy all these years later, she certainly gave a lot to this country and to the world, and I think we owe her all that. So with that said, I just want to say first, thank you to the Historical Center for allowing me to present here again. But I also have to give a shout out to to the Palmer Public Library for their assistance. They were very, very helpful in my research, but also to the FDR Library, the Eleanor Roosevelt Valkill Partnership Mission in Hyde Park. I just have to tell you real quick, I reached out to them in August, and I had said, I'm thinking of doing this. They were so excited they retweeted my Abraham Lincoln presentation I gave here last year. And they said, coming soon, Eleanor Roosevelt. So I knew right then and there, okay, I'm committed to it. But they were very helpful, and without their support, I couldn't have done this. They were very helpful. So I just want to give a shout out to the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. And thank you for coming. I went on a little bit longer than I had planned, but that happens. And with that said, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. So thank you.